Thanks, Wes. Okay. Clicker's not working. Okay, we'll just go keyboard.
And take the mic with you if you want to walk around.
Yeah. Okay, no clicker. Anyway, right. Yes, thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking about how to explain ST2110 to a 6-year-old. Hopefully, you should be able to explain this to a normal person at a dinner party, or I've done this before Christmas once, this presentation, and I said you should be able to explain this at your Christmas dinner. But there's probably more interesting things to talk about. But the point being, I think it's a yeah. So what does the company I work for do? We make encoders and decoders for sports, news, and channel contribution. We're based in central London, so right next to Big Ben. So I can see Big Ben. I'll look to my left on my desk, and Big Ben is there. We built everything ourselves. So all the hardware, all the firmware, all the software. So we did a full in-house 2110 stack, no third-party components, and not to be confused with the free streaming OBS. So what is ST2110? Famously, well, probably misappropriated to Albert Einstein. If you can't explain something to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And personally, I've never seen any webinars or papers really explain this properly as a concept. They are either way too detailed and go way into the weeds, or ironically do the opposite and don't explain the concepts and hand wave away some of these issues. And many of these issues, actually, personally, my team have spent years working on them, and I really find it hilarious when the speakers go, oh, yeah, this little thing here, and they just walk on. And that's not what it should be. And they're often very full of jargon, and there's no real explanation of what the problem is trying to be solved. It's just this is how we're solving it. So let's try and simplify years of work into 15, 20 minutes. So where are we at? And again, I am trying as hard as possible to explain this to a normal person off the street. The man on the Clapham omnibus is famously the term that people use for these things. So live television production uses what's known as SDI cables, and this is obviously probably quite basic for you guys, but we'll start. This is an old-fashioned electrical signal. What was transmitting what was a large amount of data back in the days, many gigabits. So in the 90s and 2000s, doing gigabits was, quite a challenging thing. But nowadays, my cell phone can process several gigabits without a sweat. It's one TV signal. So that's a TV signal consists of pictures and sounds in a single cable, and other historical signals. It requires relatively expensive equipment to switch between these signals that are specific to the television industry. And because I said it's one channel per cable, we have lots of channels these days, lots of extra content, and it requires a lot of cabling. This stuff is heavy, so if you're in a truck, it makes the truck weigh a lot. It's difficult to put through. SDI cables are hard in some respects. So where things are, we don't want to use old-fashioned cabling, right? This is old-fashioned stuff. Coaxial cable. Probably very few of you even have coaxial cables in your homes anymore. And things like the internet are growing very quickly in terms of data usage with YouTube, social media, big data, and I put in this year AI. AI is using astonishing amounts of data. AI is driving this graph faster and faster. So they're doing 400 gigabit. AI is doing 800 gigabit, terabits. OpenAI, these kind of guys are building massive facilities. And so we want to be able to ride off the back of this. So we can use this internet technology, but not necessarily the internet itself, just the technology used to build the internet and data centers to send these pictures and sounds around a facility. And that's known as IP, Internet Protocol. So what we do is we take, so every 5 years, and it's probably not going to be every 5 years, it's going to be every 3 years or every 2 years because of the rapid demands probably of AI these days. I think in the last 10 years it was video, it was online video, but AI is really going to be the one pushing all this stuff. So what we do is we take a television signal, a picture and sounds, and we chop these up into thousands of little pieces, into packets, and we send this over a wired network. And that means a single cable can now take hundreds of television signals, not just one. And this equipment, pound for pound, is cheaper because it's from a much bigger industry. There are data centers, AI data centers, bigger than football fields. You could fit all of television in probably one corner. It's not a big deal, relatively speaking. So we need to talk about time to do this. Time is a tricky thing to talk about, but because we're so used to time actually working now in our lives. But this wasn't necessarily the case. So things like microwaves, they don't necessarily have a way of telling the time. So you put your time in and maybe a few months later that time isn't correct anymore. Same with your oven or other things. They won't be the same. And that's because the clock inside every device is slightly different. So the clock in your oven versus your microwave, and that's, yeah, dependent on, say, the heat of a device, location, because of altitude, that affects the way the clock moves, or the manufacturer of the clock. And yes, we're used to things like our phones connecting to get their time, but part of one of the challenges of 2110 is making sure everyone is using the same time. So television pictures, again, we'll start basic, are a series of still images put together such that they move. And they're generated based off a clock or a camera on the microphone. And if these two clocks don't match, you're not able to easily cut between these images. You can see this camera angle versus this one. You see they're not aligned, so you can't cut between the two of them. And what we do currently is we take an even older signal and we plug that in, an analog signal, to keep these together. And that's yet another cable that needs to be plugged into a device. So we're in cable mess to keep these aligned. So now all of these pictures have the same amount of time. There's no drift between them. So you can now cut between 1 and 2 easily to show different angles. It's worth pointing out that things like Zoom and Webcast, they don't do this. They will delay by an extra frame. So that means you have latency so that they can cut between 2 signals. So we got to talk a bit more, unfortunately, about time. So what is a leap year? So this year, I think, was a leap year, if I recall. This is when an extra day is added because the Earth doesn't perfectly go around the sun. It's not 365 days, the Earth going around the sun. It's 365.2422, actually. But one day isn't enough. Like, it's not exactly one day, the correction. So you have these things known as leap seconds. So like most years, you skip the 29th of February. Well, there are sometimes you skip the odd second here and there to compensate for this. But this is a problem where I am. I talked about Big Ben. So in the UK, if time jumps by 1 second, that means when the Big Ben rings, there'll be a glitch on all the television receivers. And a device like your phone uses a time source that jumps. So it has leap seconds, and this is a problem. So what we use is GPS. So that's the thing you use for satellite navigation as a time source. This is a very high quality time source. It has no leap seconds. And we take this GPS signal, essentially, and transport it as IP packets over the network. And this is what's known as PTP, Precision Time Protocol. But it's much better quality than a normal internet collected clock. So it has no leap seconds and is much higher, so higher quality. So what we do is we take these pictures and sounds and we split them up into thousands of little packets. So yeah. But this is the bit where it gets tricky, and this is the bit where I see all the speakers hand wave away. So what we do is we use something called the PTP Epoch. So we assume that all of television started on this day at this exact time. That wasn't the case in reality because there probably wasn't any digital television, but we assume it did start. And we assume that clock is still ticking, so video frames are still being produced. So if I want to start sending 2110, I have to wait for the next tick, and then I can start sending. And that tick is measured relative to this 1st of January 1970. So we work out how many pictures we should have sent, and then we say, we need to send the next one at this time, and we start sending. So you see, we imagine that time started, pictures were being sent. 54 years later, or 54 and a half years later, we measure up to this point and we continue. So that means everyone is now agreed that this particular time was the start point. Because otherwise, all of you start filming with a camera, you turn it on, and all your cameras, some of you will be here, some of you will be here, some of you will be here. So we've picked a point that everyone can agree to. So we now have all these pictures and sounds split into packets and being sent over the network. These are given an address, so they can send to more than one place. And these are lots of packets, millions per second. And the value of this is really useful. If I'm a device that only cares about sound, I don't need to bother receiving video. I don't need this high data video if I'm here just to process the audio. But you have an issue, right? Because when you receive these packets, you have to know when they are from. So when this guy hits the ball, you want to make sure that when the sound of the kick is aligned, because you've now cut the video up, separated the video and the audio, and when you receive them, you have to align them back together so that otherwise, if the kick is early or the kick is late, it will look very strange. So what we do is we put the time on each packet. So that's known as a timestamp. So we can put this puzzle back together. So any 2110 receiver receives a bunch of packets, reads the timestamps, aligns everything back together. So then for display or whatever other processing, such that when a ball is kicked, for example, these timestamps, which are PTP timestamps, can be used. So yeah, we want to use modern technology. To conclude, we want to use modern technology to make live television, and we've agreed across for a common time across everybody. So all of us now agreed on time. This was different in the past. We never agreed. Everyone started and ran at their own time. We split these pictures up into thousands of packets, and we make sure that we send them at the agreed time. So the same number of video pictures since 1970, we all now agree that we all start at the same time again. Anyone that wants to receive them, so I send all of you guys a bunch of packets, some video, some sound. You guys read the timestamps and reassemble everything. And to be honest, the rest is just jargon, they're just fancy words, and the rest is just implementation details. There's nothing particularly complicated about REST, but at a high level, that's what we're trying to solve, these points. So if you want to explain, again, I have this thing, you know, at work, whenever we're stuck on a problem, it's like, how would you explain this problem to your mother? That's basically what the takeaway is. So yeah, any questions? I'm also available on booth 2442 in the UK section, but happy to answer questions.